It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this book conference on the framework of new EU-UK relations. This is, I'm delighted to say, the third annual book conference of the Brexit Institute since it was established in 2017, and the proceedings of this event will be published in a third volume of the book series, The Law and Politics of Brexit, which I edit at Oxford University Press. Let me also add, the book will feature a preface by the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli. Due to his busy agenda, he could not join us to open the conference this afternoon, but I think his decision to write a written text for the book is a seal of approval and an endorsement to the great contributors to this conference and the follow-up book. So I want to take the opportunity to sincerely thank all friends from across Europe, Ireland, and the UK that are joining us today. Let me also, of course, thank, in my role as director, the sponsors of the Brexit Institute, which are enabling all of our activities, and particularly AIB, Grant Thornton, and GSK Stockman Luxembourg, who among others are supporting us. I should acknowledge also the Brexit Institute is receiving some funding from the European Union through the Erasmus Plus program. In the next day and a half, we will have the extraordinary opportunity to examine in depth the new framework of EU-UK relations, including but not limited to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And I obviously shall say the timing for this could hardly be better. I'm sure all of you will have followed the news just yesterday night and this morning about the challenges in the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But of course, ratification is also, just as we speak, going on in the European Parliament to complete the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. So I'm truly delighted that we have a leading group of experts. And without further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to my new dean, Professor Derek Hand, who will be moderating the first panel. Just as a housekeeping rule, let me say we are recording this event so that we can make it later available online on the Brexit Institute YouTube channel. And also, as Derek might or might not say, we will have a Q&A session after the panel, and people can either send their question through the chat or please ask us to unmute themselves so they can directly speak. So once again, thank you all, and Derek, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Federico, and thank you for inviting me to chair this opening session. And as Federico said, the timing for a discussion such as this, I think, is important in terms of what's happening over the last number of days. So this session will be dealing with Northern Ireland, particularly in the peace process and Brexit. And we have a panel of 3 papers. And as Federico said, each panelist, each paper will be 15 minutes long, and we will take them consecutively. And then after they have all been delivered, we are open for questions and discussion. So the first speaker today is Professor Michael Cox, who is Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and founding director of LSE Ideas, the school's world-ranked foreign policy think tank. Before joining the LSE, he was Professor of International Politics at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth, and between 1972 and 1995, taught at Queen's University of Belfast. He's written widely on the end of the Troubles in the North of Ireland. He's been editor of Irish Studies in International Affairs, and he also delivered the keynote lecture at the annual conference of International Affairs Standing Committee of the Royal Irish Academy in 2017. And today, Michael will be talking on the evolving transatlantic relationship. Okay, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction, Derek. And as people out there will notice, I have a long association both with Dublin through the Royal Irish Academy and also with Queen's, and it's wonderful to be back in Dublin, back in Ireland overall. And I also think congratulations to to Federico and for DCU for creating the Brexit Institute. I'm talking to you in Dublin, of course, where you have a Brexit Institute, which I think is wonderful. I've also got a very good friend in Cardiff called Richard Wynne-Jones, who's just brought out a book today on Englishness. And guess what he set up? He set up a Centre for English Identity and Politics. So it seems that those in Dublin and indeed in Cardiff kind of take the questions in some senses. I'm not saying more seriously, but as seriously, and for interesting reasons. So again, congratulations to you all on the Brexit Institute and to Federico for the publications. And the third one, I hope, and I'm sure will be as comprehensive and as clear and as good as the first one. Now, what have I attempted to do in my particular chapter, which Federico asked me to write? We had a little bit of a discussion how it would go, but in the end, we've alighted on a topic which actually has not much been done on, I think, Federico, be fair to say, which is not just the transatlantic relationship in the context of Brexit and by definition Trump, although is that history now? We'll have to wait and see, but also on Brexit directly with the transatlantic relationship. And I would say not by way of criticism, but simply by way of observation. And I've been following, for obvious reasons, the Brexit debate both over here and through many other works I've been engaged in with colleagues around the island, around these various islands of ours. I've noticed really the focus has largely been on what impact it's going to have on the British economy. Not surprisingly, at the London School of Economics, you won't be surprised to hear there's a lot of work going on that. A lot of work going on identity. Again, my good colleague Richard Wynne-Jones in Cardiff has done a lot of work on Englishness and notions of Englishness, and that is a form of identity. A lot of work obviously done in Dublin on the impact it's going to have on Ireland, both north and south and north together. And of course, not surprisingly too, a lot of work done on the relationship between Britain, UK, the London government and the European Union. So this is all entirely right and all entirely legitimate. And of course, some excellent work has been done. Yesterday, I was actually chairing a session for friends and colleagues in Washington, looking at Brexit and looking at the relationship between the UK and the EU going forward. And I have to give you an update. Things are not going well. It's not just the new announcement on Northern Ireland. The negotiations now going between London and Brussels have gone particularly badly since the agreement was signed on December 24th. And the people who were speaking yesterday, one from the Financial Times and another friend, Tim Oliver, who's done a lot of work on Brexit, you know, the situation is not looking at all well. Predictably, I raised that question yesterday. It wasn't, I think much of what we're seeing at the moment is not unexpected, except by those who argued and made the case for Brexit. And here again, I think this is one of the great paradoxes and possibly tragedies of our times. There's a point made by Roy Foster, the great historian of Ireland, on, you know, the most important things that happen are those which you simply don't think are ever going to happen. It's the unintended consequences of decisions. And I think that's what we're living through. That's what we're living through. Expected, but to some, at least the Brexiteers, really quite unexpected, I think. I have to believe that as well. But what I'm going to focus on largely is this transatlantic dimension and the Brexit relationship with the transatlantic relationship. Now, taking you back, if you can go back that far to, what was it, spring of 2016, Mr. Cameron, the then Prime Minister, in a somewhat desperate situation, I would imagine by then, thought he could bring and tap into the appeal that the then President Obama had in Britain, which of course was extraordinarily popular in Europe, as he was inside the United Kingdom. And he allowed or suggested that Obama intervene, take a role in the Brexit debate. And you remember the famous phrase, I always remember it well, you'll go to the back of the queue if you decide to vote to leave. He made that very, very clear. Who was his vice president at the time? Well, I don't need to remind you who it was. It was Joe Biden. And I think that gives you a little bit of an indication of some of the problems going forward that the current UK government based in London is going to have. Now, why did the then President Obama argue, and I think this is a pretty obvious argument, most people know what I'm about to say, I think. Why did he argue you'll go to the back of the queue? Well, basically what he was saying in another way is the United States, as a general principle, much prefers the UK to remain within the European Union. You remember one of the arguments that General de Gaulle used back in the 60s, and when he vetoed British membership of then the community twice, was that if Britain joins, it's like America joining. You know, Britain becomes to use the old famous Greek analogy, it becomes the Trojan horse within the EU, and perhaps in some respects, de Gaulle, as in many things, was actually not entirely incorrect, I think. Whether we want to call it a Trojan horse, I don't know. It's very unfashionable to use those kinds of analogies now, but it was a point. But nonetheless, the whole point was that Britain within the EU at the high table, sitting at the high table, obviously with a large economy and all sorts of assets, which it still possesses, of course, in a way didn't always express the American point of view, but nonetheless would be a voice that the Americans would rely on. And we can see that from the long history of the UK-US relationship to the European Union, and on some major key issues. There's no question on, and actually not always to the bad either. Let me be clear about that. You know, on questions like trade liberalization, enlargement to East Central Europe in the 1990s and up until 2004, on a whole range of issues, you know, Britain did have a position which was, let's be blunt, not a million miles away from that of the United States. So it wasn't just a kind of a flip comment, you'll go to the back of the queue. It was also expressing, I think, a profounder American view that a UK within the EU was a stabilizing factor within the EU, would express certain views which were closer to the United States than, say, those which would be expressed by France, and nonetheless would therefore be a major ally and an asset only as so long as it remained within the EU. From that point of view, therefore, and I'll make the point rather bluntly, and I hope boldly, therefore, Brexit was a major strategic defeat for the United States. You know, I take this view very strongly because I don't think it's emphasized quite enough, because having the UK, whatever government, of course, didn't really matter, having the UK inside the EU, therefore gave the US its own voice inside the EU. I don't want to talk about puppets and poodles. I think that's not the kind of language I think I want to use, nor do I think it's useful. But nonetheless, I think you get the point. So from that point of view, immediately Brexit has a major consequence for the US, because it no longer has at the high table of the EU a voice like that of the UK. So almost as a stroke, you could say that Brexit deals a double blow to its relationships in the world. The first blow, of course, is directed against the EU itself, and we're still living through that. And I'm not at all surprised that the relationship is becoming increasingly conflictual. By definition, it was bound to, and I can't see it getting any better for a very long time. I'm not in the optimistic camp on that, Federico. I'm very much in the pessimistic. There's a kind of logic of conflict which is working its way out at the moment, and I can't see it in the short term getting any better. Maybe in the medium term it might. And secondly, of course, it was a double blow. Of course, it was to the United States in its position. One thing then happened in November, which I think covered up the story, if I might put it in my own, again, slightly lurid language, which is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, of course, was a formidable supporter of Brexit. His own victory, he said, would be like Brexit plus, plus, plus. He didn't deliver very much, by the way, to the UK, and he didn't like Mrs. May. They did like Boris Johnson, as we'll talk about in a moment. But in a way, the promise of Trump, the promise of a big trade deal, his support for Brexit, which was not inconsiderable, and it wasn't just Trump, by the way, Steve Bannon, a whole group of people, but in and around Trump were advocates and strong supporters of Brexit in June, and then went on to further try to support, at least in rhetoric, Brexit. I think what that delivered to some of the Brexiteers was a kind of sense, well, we've got somebody in the White House. You know, America will ride to our rescue on a white horse, and we'll get that trade deal. What happened in terms of the trade deal? Nothing. Lots of talk, but you know, you're not going to get a trade deal with somebody who's a trade warrior. I mean, that was the fundamental contradiction of the Brexiteers looking to Trump. You know, Trump, as they always said and still say today, is a transactionalist. What he believes is America first. And in essence, he's a trade warrior. He said it himself. He believes in protections. And so he's the last person on earth one would be looking for a trade deal when he's denouncing trade deals all over the world. So the Brexiteers, in a sense, were basing themselves on something of an illusion, but it carried them through, I think. It carried them through, and they thought that they would, or at least get close to something like a trade deal. And of course, with Trump in the White House, they had somebody who came to support quite strongly, in fact, although they're trying to deny it now, strongly came to support Boris Johnson when he finally became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Then, of course, something else happened in November of 2020, and that was the election of Joe Biden. Federico made me think about this a lot, and I thank you for this, Federico, because it did make me think more and more about this. I would actually see the election of Biden as really a major defeat for Boris Johnson. I mean, you know, all European leaders came out with all the statements they needed to come out with when an American president is elected. You always do that. And none said it more fulsomely, or indeed more, I think, more convincingly than the Irish T-shirt. Johnson said, we are now moving out of dark times, which was kind of an ironic statement, given that in a sense he'd been part of those dark times. But nonetheless, I think there's no doubt about it that the Biden victory represented a major setback for the Brexiteers and for the Brexit project. I don't know, and we still need to get more evidence to demonstrate this, but very, very quickly, Johnson, who's then in the midst of negotiations with the EU on the agreement, that agreement went through on December the 24th. Would it have happened with Trump? I don't know. We can only speculate. There may be more evidence to be gathered in than we actually know. All we do know is on December the 24th, that particular trade deal, the TCA, was actually signed on December the 24th. And I'm bound to say that I don't think it was entirely a coincidence. I think, therefore, I think it was almost certainly true that the US under Biden brought pressure to bear in those negotiations. And certainly, to put it another way, even if they didn't bring pressure to bear, Johnson no longer had a backstop, that backstop being called Donald Trump, an enemy of the EU, a very strong enemy of the EU, and an equally strong supporter of Brexit. The other reason, of course, why the Biden election, I think, does represent a major setback for the Brexiteers in terms of where they now go from here with the UK, because after all, they do have a very large majority in the House of Commons, as I'm sure you're aware. And the Labour Party, as far as I can see, is never going to get back into power for at least another 15 or 20 years, given the current state of British and Scottish politics. In that situation, you know, you've now got somebody who's not only anti-Brexit, but very pro-EU. Now, how that relationship with the EU finally works its way through for Biden, I think still needs to be, we'll still have to wait and see, Federico. I think it's not entirely clear, Derek, either, that I think that this is going to be an easy relationship. We welcome Biden because he's not Trump. He's none of the above. He's not Trump, therefore it's got to be better by definition. But I still think there's some pretty tough negotiations going ahead on questions like China, on questions like trade, on questions like Iran and the nuclear deal. And Biden, of course, is in a very difficult situation. And let's be fair, many in the European Union, and they've said it quite openly, then they saw those 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump, and they wonder how secure Biden really is back in the United States itself. And therefore, they're being cautious, really, towards Biden. But in terms of the Brexit relationship, I think that is proving to be extraordinarily difficult. Notice in any of the discussions between Johnson and people around him, Biden has talked not one little bit about trade deals, not once, and he won't. I'm absolutely certain. One thing I am fairly certain of, there's not going to be an immediate trade deal for the very obvious reason that Biden has to rebuild the US economy, for a broader reason that America is still a fairly protectionist economy in many, many areas. Let's not forget that they're not natural free traders, if I can put it in those terms. And thirdly, because Biden is going to go for a very strong Buy America strategy, economic strategy. He's made it very clear that one of his priorities is to rebuild American economy and buy America. And that is not going to be great for a new trade deal with the UK. One final point, because this obviously has to relate back to Ireland, Northern Ireland, which I think others like John and Eileen, I hope we'll talk about, and Dagmar. Clearly this has an impact on Ireland. There's absolutely no doubt about that either. In part because it was bound to anyway, because of the whole Good Friday Agreement and the whole question of the protocol, but also because Biden is an Irishman. And, you know, I don't want to kind of overplay this. And sometimes when I do overplay it, people say, no, it won't be like that. But I kind of do think it will make a difference. And not because of any romantic views. You know, I know where he comes from, Ballina, within that fine West Irish town. You know, there's a great statue of a French general, by the way. If you don't know, you should go there. Humboldt. I know it quite well because I know the west of Ireland extremely well. It's not just the romantic side of it, it is also the very practical side of it. Biden was part of a whole campaign in the 80s, Friends of Ireland. He was part of that group who was central and instrumental with Clinton going forward to the Good Friday Agreement. And also he's very dependent within Congress on that very large Irish American and other vote, which is absolutely crucial to his own background, etc. So again, it's going to present, and this is why what you said earlier on, Derek, is so important. What is now happening in Northern Ireland really could have, you know, really quite deep consequences, not only between the two parts of the island of Ireland, or between Dublin and London, or Belfast and London, all three together, but also could have some impact on the transatlantic relationship. Last year, and I'll end here, Derek, quickly, Nancy Pelosi came, and you know, she did a lecture at the LSE, which was wonderful, actually. And she also came over to Ireland, and she made it quite clear the Good Friday Agreement stands, and we will stick behind the protocol. There will be no hard border on the island of Ireland. And if therefore the Conservatives today begin to buckle under pressure, as it seems they may well do, and we'll have to see where we work it out, this again could have some pretty deleterious consequences for Britain's relationship with the US. So at that I will conclude, Federico. I've thrown out a few, I hope, provocations to get us to think more widely about the context of the Brexit decision back in 2016.
Thank you for that, Michael. Some really, I think, interesting insights to start our discussion in terms of Brexit and the present position. And of course, as you said, even before we started, everything is connected. So of course, we see everything in a local perspective here, but the protocol in Northern Ireland is part of a bigger picture. Anyway, lots of food for thought for everybody after all our speakers have presented. So thank you again, Michael. And our next speaker is Professor Dagmar Schiek, Senate Family Chair for EU Law at the University College Cork. She has been a Professor of European Law from 2000 in Germany and the UK. And she's been awarded a Jean Monnet ad personam chair in 2011, a recognition for her high-level achievements in the field of EU studies, partly outside her country of origin. She was, before joining UCC, she was in the Queen's University Belfast, where she directed the Centre of European and Transnational Studies. And today, Dagmar is going to talk about the implementation of the Withdrawal Agreement.
Yeah, thank you. And I must really join the congratulations to Federico. This is a great conference. And I also like the concept that you discuss your books publicly before they're even published. Yes, so I like that, especially for my chapter, because it's so dull, and I hope to get some ideas how it can become more interesting. I should say that I also remain connected to Queen's University Belfast as an honorary professor. So I'm basically an all-Ireland professor with a focus on Ireland and the EU. So I've prepared a presentation, and I hope this whole thing works, because I'm much better with Teams than with Zoom. So share screen goes here. Oh, there we go. Share screen didn't work. There we go. And I think that should be it. Yes, that's not too bad. Okay, so as I think the chair said my chapter is called Brexit and the Implementation of the Withdrawal Agreement. And before I even started writing, I provoked Federico in saying, can't we have something else like implementing the withdrawal agreement, a permanent struggle? And of course we can't, because this is Oxford University Press and has to be grown up. But my idea, how to make my overall idea for this chapter is that the withdrawal agreement, while it is intended to be not permanent, it's intended to be a divorce deal, will continually shape the EU-UK relationship, because there are elements, as in a divorce, where you have ongoing dealings with your ex-partner, which you would rather forget. And that also happens in relation with the separation of the EU and the UK, which of course we all hope won't be permanent. Mainly the elements with long-term effects are the retained citizenship rights of those who have used their free movement rights. Just imagine somebody moved from the UK to the EU or the other way around, aged 22, in full working power in 2020, and then they become retired along the way somewhere, and their pension rights are impacted by the withdrawal agreement. So that's a long-term relationship. And the protocol island, Northern Ireland, assuming that a division of Ireland doesn't go away in the medium term, will also remain a long-term commitment. It's not officially permanent because, of course, there is Article 13.4, which says it can be replaced by permanent relationships, but we shall see. So these parts are also potential for struggle, because I think they try to extend elements of the bygone EU membership of the UK into the future, and that parts in both parts that refers to their effect. So they both create rights which are supposed to be supreme and directly effective, and also their supervision retains some competences for the ECJ in the citizenship part, not permanently, but for Northern Ireland permanently. So that's what was the idea. Now, the struggle already starts when you think, what do we mean by implementation? Do we mean by implementation just the faithful fulfilling of obligation which are spelled out in the agreement, which tends to be the EU view, or do we think it is rather an opportunity for renegotiating everything? Looking at the withdrawal agreement, it supports both ideas, because the withdrawal agreement says the main body to implement the withdrawal agreement is a joint committee, and the joint committee under Article 164 of the withdrawal agreement is empowered to change the withdrawal agreement in specified areas, but those specified areas include correcting of any errors without changing the substance. And so that's a wide berth. So it's somewhere the implementation is between implementing and renegotiation. So nevertheless, we see that the institutions to implement the agreement have been implemented properly. So we have a joint committee, which is meeting as often as it should, sometimes more frequent, sometimes less frequent. We have specialized committees, which meet as well. We have one institution which hasn't quite fully implemented yet. That's a joint consultative working group for the protocol. And it was supposed to meet already, is supposed to meet every month from February 2020, which just hasn't done. It has, there is a proposal for its common working, which is still not adopted properly. And I think they have met in January. So that's confirmed. We have implementation needs. We had implementation needs for the arbitration procedure, which is a main procedure to implement the withdrawal agreement. And that has happened. So we have arbitration panels and arbitration chairs. The chairs are agreed. The panel members are not agreed. Didn't have to be agreed. They have been nominated. And I didn't dwell on the international arbitration procedures in the chapter, if I think that's all right. Now, moving on to the second part, which I focus on in the chapter, the citizens' rights. And these are, of course, not the permanent prolongation of citizens' rights. It's only for those who have moved. Their trust in the permanence of the EU should be yes, honored, and they shouldn't lose their rights in the future. Of course, they do lose their rights in the future. UK citizens having moved to the EU can't move to any other EU member states if that, except under their national law. It's not guaranteed by the withdrawal agreement. And EU citizens having moved to the UK will lose some rights as well, mainly political rights. So, but possibly the rights which are maintained are the rights to reside with your family, also with the family who isn't born yet or whom you haven't married yet, and the rights to remain integrated in the economy as a worker or a self-employed person. Now, those rights, the main discussion has been about the implementation of residence rights, and I've picked 3 member states and the UK to look how those have been implemented. Now, in the UK, all the rights are implemented by the ministerial regulations under the EU Withdrawal Agreement Act 2020. And I haven't specified this very much because all these ministerial regulations can be withdrawn. Yeah, there is some parliamentary control, but very limited. But they have been implemented, and there are web pages that tell you what to do. There's also the need to somehow ensure that the rights of citizens in the UK are supervised, because the UK resisted an ongoing competence of the EU Commission or the European Court of Justice for this important part. A replacement had to be created, and that's the Independent Monitoring Authority. Beyond my chapter, I'll tell you I have had a little experiment with the monitoring authority. Despite being a dual professor, I'm also a dual citizen of Germany and Ireland and the UK, Germany and the UK. And as such, I should have been given settled status, because it would allow me to bring any future marriage people from other countries into the UK. The UK refuses that, and I've complained to the IMA why they refuse that, and they've written me a very short answer: you don't have any rights under the WA as a British citizen. And I wasn't given any idea how to complain and how to go further. They just say, pursue your rights on the channels known to you. Oh, thank you. So I mean, I don't write about this, but what I do write about is that the IMA doesn't give on their web pages any indications for citizens how to enforce your rights. Yeah, so in the member states, Spain, France, and Germany, which I've picked because these are the member states where we have most of the UK citizens residing. That's factually the most important ones. Spain has most outside of Ireland. I've skipped Ireland because UK citizens in Ireland are quite well protected by the common travel area. Now, in those member states, France and Spain have implemented the citizens' rights by ministerial decree, just like the UK, whereas only Germany has chosen legislation. And these decrees were quite late, moved in December, some of them in June for Spain, for residence areas, and for Germany, the legislation also was in November, but it's done, it's working. Hopefully it's working. I think UK citizens are quite confused, challenged by having to apply in person in Spain and France without English language, whereas in Germany you can have dual languages. The supervision is by the national administration. There is no special authority because we also have the supervision and coordination by the EU Commission. For example, the EU Commission has issued a special regulation saying all UK citizens in the EU need to get a physical document telling them they have rights under the WA, under the withdrawal agreement. So I think there may be problems in the future considering the long-term effects, but at the moment we see that where the problems can come from, but they're not very much in a that's of course different for Ireland, Northern Ireland. And I mustn't say anything of about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, so I leave the first line speak for itself. Now, with the protocol, we have 2 parts. One part is citizenship rights and rights to move, which are Articles 2 and 3. And then we have Articles 5 to 10 with all the annexes all together, the bulk of the withdrawal agreement by number of pages, which refers to integrating Northern Ireland into the internal market for goods. Now, Articles 2 and 3 are rather inconsequential. The UK has to ensure that there's no diminution of rights through Brexit. That's of course not possible. The UK can only be obliged to achieve something they can achieve, and what they can achieve, and that they maintain anti-discrimination legislation, which they have done. And they have also expanded some of the competences of the Northern Irish Assembly on the way. So I don't see many implementation problems there. There may be looming challenges if the common travel area formalization requires results in detriments to EU citizens compared to UK citizens in Ireland. There are some indications in the healthcare sector, but I don't think that's possible. It's problematic at the moment. Well, Article 5 to 10 are of course main problematic, and we have a high number of decisions of the Joint Committee, and also they needed to be implemented by unilateral declaration, agreed unilateral declarations, a new thing in international law, I think. And then we are now moving to disputed unilateral declarations, potentially procedures before the Court of Justice, so dark clouds arise over Northern Ireland. So the challenges of the implementation of Northern Irish place in two markets increase as the EU reserves the right to diverge. And some of these are really quasi-automatic. In the chapter, I have a paragraph saying, well, all this fuss about the Article 16 preventing the export of vaccines via Northern Ireland was superfluous, because the basic regulations on limiting exports is part of the withdrawal agreement, is part of the protocol. It needs to be applied by the UK on the borders to Northern Ireland. And the EU can just, the Commission is empowered to specify this basic regulation by sub-regulations, which they have done now, and it has to be enforced by the UK. So, but there's a lot of needs to implementation. The goods at risk of moving into the European Union needed to be specified. So if Northern Ireland is part of the internal market for goods, of course, at its borders, the full power of the customs code, of the Union customs code applies. And that ensures that goods are moving into the Union with the right tariffs applied. It also ensures that goods are moving into the Union with the right quality. So that is why we have so many SPSS notifications requirements. Now, the goods which are not at risk of moving into the EU do not need those formalities, and they needed to be specified, have been specified by a decision from April 2020. And there we have, and that decision, if we implement that decision, we still need controls whether those goods are destined for certain supermarkets or not, especially if you have mixed nodes. By way of renegotiation, the parties, the UK and the EU, have agreed unilateral declarations, no less than 7 of them, in December 2020. And they refer to the control of goods even those who move on to the EU, and the control of goods implementing decision for 2020. Basically, it's called grace periods. And that gives the impression, well, until the end of March, we don't need to do anything. This isn't quite what the unilateral declaration said. The unilateral declaration said that formal declarations can be disposed of, are not necessary. And in return, the UK will allow the EU to access all the data, enabling them to after the fact control whether all those goods were moving properly and whether they have the right quality. That hasn't happened. The UK has now yesterday agreed that they expand those unilateral declarations, and the difference between the agreed and the non-agreed unilateral declaration is that the EU now reserves the right to raise a case before the European Court of Justice, which they can do under Article 12, paragraph 4 of the protocol. Yes, paragraph 4 of the protocol. There's also a unilateral declaration by the EU on the state aid that they won't use or abuse state aid law to prevent state aid being paid to British firms if that has no impact, no discernible impact on Northern Ireland. So what happens if all this doesn't work? I've spoken a little bit about this already. Article 2 and 3, if they are not implemented, it's just the usual procedures under the withdrawal agreement. focused on the negotiations in joint committee to dissolve disputes, and then followed by arbitration, ultimately temporary remedies, escalating from a lump sum to temporary suspension. Theoretical Article 16 of the protocol can only also be applied if the citizenship rights are not implemented properly, but I don't see how this could be reasoned. Consequences of failing to implement Article 5 to 7, we have the full panoply of EU remedies. It was Article 12, paragraph 2, not 4, sorry about this, which allows the EU to raise infringement procedures. Article 16 allows safeguards, however, only after a proper procedure, notification, negotiation, and then you can go to Article 16. Both parties have not complied with this so far. Article 18 allows the unilateral revocation of these provisions by the UK, not by the EU. If there is no consensus in Northern Ireland, then the UK can just say, and doesn't have to say, yes, the UK can ignore or, well, can deal with in other ways with the non-consensus in Northern Ireland, but they can also unilaterally revoke Articles 5 to 7 and 10. So what do we conclude of that? Well, first of all, off this slide, citizenship rights are weaker protected than market rights. Anything new about that? Not really in the EU. I think personally that there are pragmatic solutions for trading goods and that they are necessary and they can be found. Just imagine the Union Customs Code, which was changed in 2013 to allow fully IT-based customs processes, would have been implemented fully. Then we would have quite a fewer problems. So why not use Northern Ireland as a forerunner of these fully IT-based customs processes and make everything easier? However, even if everything is easier, there will be diversion of trade to Northern Ireland and other EU states if the same amount of goods should be available in Northern Ireland. That diversion is fought by the UK and by the Unionists. I refrain from commenting because John Doyle will certainly talk about this. And we need to think about whether the fragmentation of the internal market established by the protocol can remain a permanent feature. And there is a Article 12 in the protocol which allows the parties to develop this further, but that requires consent. So I hope I wasn't too much over the time, Mr. Chair. You should have warned me if I was. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Dagmar, for that. Again, further developing the complexity of Brexit. One single word, Brexit, contains a multitude within it, and its consequences reach far and wide. So again, more material to be thinking about in terms of questions at the end of the session. But the next paper is delivered by Professor John Doyle and Professor Eileen Connolly. Eileen Connolly is a professor in politics here in Dublin City University and was in the past the director of the Ireland India Institute in DCU. Her research interests include gender and political representation, gender and post-conflict reconstruction, and gender and the development of the Irish state. Professor John Doyle is director of the DCU Institute for International Conflict Resolution and Reconstruction, and Professor of International Conflict Resolution in DCU here in the School of Law and Government. His research interests include comparative nationalist and ethnic conflict, Northern Ireland, conflict in South Asia, and Irish foreign policy. And today their talk will deal with the peace process in Northern Ireland. Thank you, John and Eileen.
All right, Derek, thank you very much. This is very much a joint paper for myself, my colleague, Eileen Connolly, but in the interests of keeping to time and our experience, generally two people presenting a paper take longer than one. So I said I'd present it and then both of us will join in the conversation later on. So I'll just start by sharing screen. As Derek said, we're going to focus on Brexit and Northern Ireland peace process. So obviously overlapping to some extent necessarily because the Northern Ireland Protocol is such a part of that, but focusing more on the political context within which that occurs to complement Dagmar's focus on the sort of legal and institutional contexts. And I suppose to begin with, I suppose the key points we would like to make today is that the Northern Ireland Protocol and the constitutional status are linked in an ongoing way. So this wasn't a deal that got done last December, which we can now just get on with implementing. I think Dagmar's focus on that shows this is something that's going to go on into the future for as long as this type of a protocol or anything certainly we can think of that might replace it. The linkages between the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, the protocol, and the future of the EU-UK relationship are going to be very closely embedded, and in some ways going to be a thorn in the side, I suspect, of EU-UK relationships into the future. It's important, especially given the last 24 hours, that the Northern Ireland Protocol was in fact chosen by the UK because they made a decision to prioritise leaving the single market and the customs union. That was their choice. There was other options on the table, including Theresa May's draft withdrawal agreement. But once the priority was to leave the single market and the customs union, then there had to be checks somewhere. There had to be customs regulations somewhere. The EU took the view that those could not be on the land border in the island of Ireland, because that would be a breach of the assumptions of the Good Friday Agreement, where nationalists accepted the principle that Northern Ireland would have a separate vote on any future United Ireland. It wouldn't simply be the whole island as a single unit, but separate jurisdictional votes in each case, a shift from their traditional position. But in return, they had the assumption that the border would be open, there would be further cooperation and integration. And I think the last point we sort of would make is, in effect, I think Brexit has broken the Good Friday Agreement, has utterly changed the consensus that was there post-1998. And the protocol is just an aspect of that seeing out, but the change from 2016 was fairly important too. Hang on, this is not moving on. It's gonna. The sea border in the Northern Ireland Protocol, it's those three key points we'd like to make here. Even if it works, because some of the issues were simply the fact that it was the details of this were not even known on the 24th of December. It really only became apparent in the later days and right through the month of January. So inevitably there was going to be teething problems, companies that didn't see this coming, that didn't make proper preparation. That was inevitable, but that's by no means the core part of what the protocol is bringing to the future of the UK and UK relationship. So whatever technology, whatever sort of companies getting used to it, some diversion of trade, no doubt, people sourcing within Northern Ireland or within the European Union, but the remnants of the protocol are going to be attached to every aspect almost of certainly goods in the future EU-UK relationship. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I think it sits on the fact that Brexit challenged the Good Friday Agreement fairly fundamentally. You can see that in terms of a public opinion within Northern Ireland, where if you look at opinion polls and constitutional change as late as 2012, 2014, some polling, there was a relatively small minority, probably only about 50% of the self-identified Irish nationalist community and small minority of the others, those who don't identify as either nationalist unionists, would have voted for constitutional change in any sort of short term. And the wave of polls was being 2016, showing a shift and really only disputing as to what the nature and scale of that shift is rather than whether there has been a shift. But it also more fundamentally, it gave unionists the opportunity to challenge the fundamental basis of the Good Friday Agreement in terms of integration in the island of Ireland, and created opportunity to focus on individual aspects to highlight those issues. So, I mean, you would have thought from some of the commentary over the last month that there was no food in supermarkets in Northern Ireland, rather than options around some choices not being available that were there before. But unions will inevitably focus on those technical issues to highlight their opposition to the protocol, their opposition to remaining in the European Union in itself. And that's going to be how the protocol and EU relationships and UK constitutional politics interact with each other over the coming months and years. Because fundamentally, Unionists see the Irish Sea border as weakening their position within the United Kingdom, and therefore every aspect of it that causes a challenge, a technicality, a change of choice, a company changing where they're getting their goods, is going to be talked up as a fundamental problem of economics and trade, but fundamentally driven by the fact that it changes what they see as their political sort of position. And to put some context on that, I mean, Unionists have consistently opposed all-island integration. This is not a post-Brexit phenomenon. I mean, if you look back at the debates on the much weaker Sunningdale Agreement in 1973, an entirely voluntary North-South cooperative arrangement, Unionists saw that as in some ways paving the way for economic union leading to political union. I mean, they are very strong supporters of a functionalist view of politics in a way that some ways it's gone out of fashion in political science in many ways. They believe it in the context of UK politics and they believe it in the context of EU politics. They assume that these sort of integrated cooperative arrangements inevitably lead to political change, and therefore they oppose them on that grounds. So for many Unionists, and certainly for those who were the 66% who supported Brexit, they have no inherent objection to there being borders on the land border between North and South, for there being obstacles to trade between companies in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. These are a consequence of their greater priority given to other issues, and for some hardline unions possibly would even welcome those barriers as breaking the integrative dynamic they see behind the functionalist view of politics. So if you think in terms of the Brexit referendum in 2016 in Northern Ireland, I mean, well known, a clear majority, 57%, voted to remain in the European Union, but a very different breakdown of the voting patterns within the different communities in Northern Ireland. So those who identify as Irish or Irish nationalists, about 88% of them voted to remain in the European Union, whereas among those who self-identify as Unionists, only about 34% voted to remain in the European Union. And what's very interesting we've come to is that for those who don't identify strongly or at all as either nationalist or Unionist, heading now for about 20% of the overall population of Northern Ireland, their voting pattern was much closer to nationalist voting pattern than it was to Unionists. Just above 70% of those who don't identify as nationalists or Unionists voted remain. They've also been consistently opposing a hard border on the land border and are supportive of the protocol and the sea border as a second best solution. It wasn't their first solution. Their first solution was not to leave the European Union in the first place. Probably Theresa May's UK-wide might have been a better option, but they're certainly supporting a sea border as a better alternative to a land border on the island of Ireland. And the key problem for unionism today, now all three electorally significant unionist parties opposing the sea border, in a de facto, even the Ulster Unionist Party, who actually campaigned for Remain, even though majority of their supporters voted Brexit, now effectively become the decision is made supporting Brexit party. So the three key unionist parties taking a relatively hard line on Brexit and on the sea border. But the historically hegemonic unionist political class is no longer a majority within Northern Ireland. Recent elections and polls put them somewhere between 41 and 43%. So they don't command the majority to vote in the Assembly for the first time in the last elections, and are highly unlikely to command the majority in the next Assembly, and therefore don't have the votes to vote down the Northern Ireland Protocol through the provision that sits within the protocol itself, because a majority of the population in Northern Ireland and a majority of Northern Ireland's elected representatives will support the sea border and the Northern Ireland Protocol as the least worst option compared to a land border. And that's been a huge change for unionism in the last number of years, shifting from that hegemonic political position where they were the people of Ulster. So Ulster said no, it was never the unionist majority in Ulster said no. There's some that he spoke for the people in their totality. And that's a real shift for unionism now, effectively representing about 40% of the population on this issue, and therefore unable to block the sea border, which they oppose so strongly. As Dagmar mentioned, from day one, the Northern Ireland Protocol has been a source of friction, and as Mick said, that this was inevitable in terms of the future relationship of the UK and the EU. Without putting ourselves in a position of predicting the future, that was almost built in to the political and institutional dynamics that were there. So the 4-hour threat of using Article 16 on vaccines, which Dagmar said was more procedural than real, but almost whatever it was going to be, something was going to happen first. There was always going to be something where someone is working in a part of the European Commission where Northern Ireland is not on their radar. It's something we need to think about, whether that's vaccines or the innards of some regulation. And it simply doesn't occur to them that there's now a consequence for the Northern Ireland Protocol to some regulation, directive, or rule that they're writing. So it was inevitable that something would happen first, and vaccines just happened to be. Followed a few days later by the withdrawal of border staff from the ports in Larne and Belfast. Belfast port representing about 70% of the Northern Ireland's trade. We now know, based on really no evidence at all, that there was a physical threat to the workers there, very much political, so at least not from the mainstream Unionist political parties, and not evidenced by that decision that was made. And some of the claims, for example, that trade unions had asked for staff to be withdrawn, the trade unions are now demanding that those allegations be withdrawn, because they never wrote one way or the other requesting that. So there's a lot of politics around this question. The UK's unilateral move yesterday will certainly reduce trust. It may lead to EU countermeasures. And those could be a mix of legal. I mean, there's the legal options open under the protocol to pursue that. But I was reading a report just during the week that at the moment, only 4% of goods coming from the UK into the Republic of Ireland are physically checked. 20% of their paperwork checked, and about 4% are physically checked. If France or Ireland or anyone else was to go from checking 4% of goods to checking 6 or 8%, that would certainly not be a breach of any, but it would be a very significant political decision to invoke checks, which would lead to much longer queues and much longer delays in terms of people processing. So then there's the nuclear option of revisiting the TCA itself, which after all has yet to be through the European Parliament and most member states. So it is still in a question of flux. I suspect there won't be a straightforward move to the nuclear option of revisiting the TCA itself, but it certainly is going to lead to very poor relationships when those difficult things around financial services and other aspects are being revisited. If European officials negotiating them think, well, deals don't really last any longer than about 4 or 5 weeks, and you'll be back renegotiating it and trying to pull some plugs. So I think those are going to be ongoing issues. They're not going to end in March and April. Really, really significant issues are going to constantly be linked back to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And if you think of just a few ones that are, even likely, if not any departure, certainly from food and plant safety issues within the United Kingdom is going to lead to a very significant increase in checks and challenges on the British Northern Ireland border. I mean, already on the 6th of January, the UK has approved a herbicide that's banned in the European Union for use on sugar beef. It doesn't in practice have a big issue in terms of Northern Ireland, but if that was to be followed by other banned pesticides and herbicides being approved for use on UK farms, then that's going to raise issues about, well, can those goods cross into Northern Ireland? I suspect the answer will be no in those circumstances. A US trade deal might be unlikely over the next number of years, but if and when, or if one is signed, I mean, the United States will clearly want their beef to be able to access the UK market. Or, I mean, chlorinated chickens is the one that obviously makes the headlines. But there's a range of issues that will be put on the table, which could have consequences for the physical movement of goods from Britain into Northern Ireland, all of which now involve the Northern Ireland Protocol. But at one level, the people negotiating those deals probably don't think about Northern Ireland very much from one end of their working year to the next. And therefore, it won't be the first thing in their head as they're working through the internal detail of a trade deal. Somebody else is going to be calling them up and say, but. And that's something that's going to be going right through into the future in a whole range of areas that are there. And to finish with, Derek, it was the other connection between the Northern Ireland Protocol, the peace process, and the future of the UK is the very significant debate throughout the United Kingdom now on possible constitutional change. I mentioned earlier, very substantial shifts in public opinion within Northern Ireland. So we've gone to a situation where effectively about half the nationalist population, so in around 22% in polls up to about 2012, said they would vote for United Ireland if a poll was held tomorrow. That sort of classic question. We have one poll from Lord Ashcroft, hardly an Irish nationalist supporter, calling it as about 51-49 in favour of United Ireland, well within the margin of error. Lucid Talk have produced a number of polls within the margin of errors, but there are other polls, notably the Northern Ireland Life and Time, that shows the gap still much wider. All of them show a shift. All of them show a very strong change in expectations. A recent poll showed 94% of Irish nationalists expect to see United Ireland. Huge shifts in terms, and that can lead into other changes. So, and others often assumed to be small U unionists in terms of pragmatically in favour of Northern Ireland remaining in the UK, not for the traditional Ulster unionist reasons, but for a mix of economic and identity and big state, whatever reasons. In the recent Sunday Times poll last January showed effectively about 36-37% supported United Ireland or didn't know, and only 24% were firmly committed to voting to retain Northern Ireland's place within the UK if a referendum was held. So certainly they haven't become Irish nationalists, but their view of Northern Ireland's place in the UK is now much more dependent on the relationship and access to the European Union, trade, and other aspects. Scotland, with yesterday's poll, now 22 polls in a row showing an enormous majority for Scottish independence. Almost inevitable a second referendum. No guarantee it will be carried, of course. It's still very, very close in all of those polls, bar one. But there's certainly a dynamic there now that wasn't there pre. And just a place Mick knows very well, obviously Wales, the largest ever support for independence in a poll, an ITV poll on a TV program been published this evening. Their headlines are pro-vote for the program, showing 40% of people said they would vote for independence if a referendum was held tomorrow. So that's just absolutely unparalleled in Welsh politics. I think the previous highest was 33%, and in the teens is much more common in opinion polls. So really dramatic shifts in terms of Wales, where probably was least expected to be seen in the short term. And in Scotland, almost seems to be the settled view of 53% of Scottish people that this is their view. And how does the UK respond to this domestic dynamic that impacts on its relationships with the European Union? I would suspect that Scotland probably features more highly on Boris Johnson's thinking than Northern Ireland when he thinks about the future of the Union. I had sort of informally that the first meeting of sort of broader civil society in terms of the future of the Union, they forgot to invite people from Northern Ireland. So they hastily filled it in. It's just people sitting in Downing Street, it just didn't occur to them. It wasn't that it was a deliberate choice. They just forgot. Because it was about Scotland. Even then, it wasn't about Wales. It was just about Scotland. That's what the future of the Union Directorate is about. But if they want to prioritise winning a second referendum from their point of view, in other words, defeating the call for Scottish independence, one would suspect they need a reasonable relationship with the European Union, given the high support for good relationships and even EU membership in Scotland, and the much higher support than compared to Northern Ireland for Scotland remaining. On the other hand, if they want to assuage the pressure coming from Ulster Unionists, they will probably adopt a confrontational attitude with the European Union, because the three major Unionist parties are effectively Brexit supporters and will welcome a hard line and welcome challenges to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So domestically, the Johnson government is going to be pulled in different directions by the constitutional debate now ongoing. Scotland pulling them in one direction and Northern Ireland Unionists pushing them in another. And where does their own state interests in terms of a trade deal with the European Union and all the other aspects around that of security and data protection and everything else that's there, how does that interact with the constitutional? And I think we would have said it yesterday. I think I can safely say it was in our chapter we sort of sent Federico before yesterday, but unpredictable is all you can sort of say about those issues. There would be a very brave person who would call how certainly the Johnson administration will balance those competing pressures of trade, Scotland, Northern Ireland, other interests. We can absolutely say will lead to increased political instability and increased uncertainty as to how the UK will approach the future of its relationship to the European Union. Here.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Eileen, for that paper. What strikes me is law, trade, identity, the past and the future, all of it coming together in this one kind of moment. So I want to thank all the speakers and for everybody sticking to time. And now we can take questions from the floor. And I think people have the ability to unmute themselves or let themselves be known if they want to ask a question, or they can type something into the chat function and I'll read it out to the panel. So if anybody has any immediate questions, they want to. Stunned into silence by
Eric, can I just acknowledge
yes.
that former Taoiseach Bertie Ahern is also in the audience. I don't know whether he wants to step in as a great expert, of course, of the Good Friday Agreement that he brokered.
Yes. I don't know. Anybody have any questions or quick?
Yeah,
Sorry,
Federico,
Bertie, yes.
Chairman, yeah, it just thanks very much for the presentations and really interesting. I suppose one of the points that we should mention is what happened yesterday or happened last night, where you had the chairman of the Loyalist Communities Council, who've been big supporters of the Good Friday Agreement from the start. But they have now withdrawn their support from the Good Friday Agreement. The chair of that presently is David Campbell, who was one of the senior negotiators when I was negotiating the agreement with Tony Blair. He was working then with David Trimble. It's up in the ante, there's no doubt about that. But I'd just be interested in what the panelists think, or what maybe John, who's been dealing with this issue with Eileen, what they think of that development, because while they have said it, they want it all peaceful and everything, thankfully, it still is moving it just from the political parties into the loyalist communities. And I think that is an escalation of the whole politicizing, as what John was mentioning.
Yes, John.
Eileen, do you want to?
Yeah, Eileen.
Yeah, I think it is an escalation, but I think we're between a rock and a hard place. I think there is the possibility of low-level violence, low-level confrontation, whichever direction you go in, whether it's a land border or a sea border. There are marginal forces at the edges of unionism and nationalism that would challenge any decision, any agreement or actions that were put in place. And I don't think it's possible to have a politically negotiated agreement if it's in people's minds that any threat from either side has to derail your decisions. I think it's part and parcel of the real instability that's been created by Brexit, that we are now back in a situation where this level of conflict is more possible than it's been at any time since the late 90s.
Could I jump in there too and agree entirely with what Eileen has just said and what John said earlier on. I think what's so extraordinary about this, Bertie, going back, is that when Brexit happened and when the argument for Brexit was made by the Brexiteers, I don't think anybody even once, as I think, John, you hinted at this, even suggested that this would have major constitutional implications, either for the Good Friday Agreement, they thought it was settled, or indeed for the for the union with Scotland, and indeed now, to some degree, Wales. And I kind of see the situation, I think, as Bertie was hinting at, and I think you touched on it, Eileen. I see it as being potentially very dangerous. I mean, you know, big events start with small beginnings, and I'm not saying there's a restoration of where we were up until 1998 with the final ceasefire and finally with the Good Friday Agreement and then the decommissioning which then followed. I don't think it's going to be that, but it unsettles in rather important and significant ways. Moreover, as somebody who lived in Northern Ireland, you know, for over 20 years, you know, the loyalist sensitivity on this is, you know, and I'm only saying the obvious, as somebody who lived there and watched this unfold, even during the Lawn strike of 1974 against one of the agreements then, you know, the sensitivity of the loyalists on this issue, I think, is very deep and very profound. And the more uncertain and more insecure they become, the more likely we are going to see some kind of backlash. Now, I don't know what form that will take, but I think the backlash is there. You've seen it in those slogans that you put up there, you know. So I just wonder how problematic the situation is. I'm always more of an optimist in the long term, but I just wonder in the short term. I'm interested to hear what other people have to say. That this looks it looks potentially quite dangerous to me, potentially quite. And what Bertie just hinted at, I think, takes us in that direction. I don't know what you think about that, Bertie.
Yeah. Dagmar, did you have something to say there? Yeah.
If you don't mind, I mean, what I have always thought that Brexit is much more dangerous for the Unionist community than for the nationalist community, because the nationalist community, Brexit supports their desire, which is unified Ireland, whereas for the Unionist community, it took away the pragmatic way of having no borders in any direction without that being politicized, because it was EU. And as soon as Brexit happened, that went away. And that's why I always was very impressed by Mike Nesbitt's former position as a unionist, standing and losing an election on voicing those concerns. And we now see that he was right. So I personally, well, I've only lived in Northern Ireland for 6 years, but I live close to land, so maybe that's something. And I think that what I see on the streets, what I see also in our little village, which is seen as non-sectarian, shows that there is more preparedness to actually smash windows and do things like that, which is low-level disturbance.
You could go into Paula. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Dagmar. I have one question here. There's Vernon has his hand up, but a question here from Shauna, whose mic isn't working. And it says, what is your view on Northern Ireland and its lack of voice in the making of future EU policy, which will be implemented in Northern Ireland? Does the EU recognise this, or does it regard it as an issue for the UK to deal with? Maybe John or...
I mean, I suppose at one level that's the inevitable consequence of Brexit. I mean, even on simple things around regulatory rules, I mean, there probably are only 3 significant regulatory rules on trade in the world: the US, the Chinese, and the European Union. I mean, most companies you know, if you're in Zimbabwe, you're not going to produce goods just for the Zimbabwe market. You're going to look at South Africa, or you're going to look abroad. And the inevitability that most UK companies will continue to meet European standards, because if they want to export, the chances of them adopting Chinese or American standards are not high. So the illusion that you can decide to build anything in any way to any standard you like, if you want to sell anywhere outside of the United Kingdom, has been lost. So I think Northern Ireland will, to some extent, been voiceless. I think the Irish government will inevitably try to bring some of those concerns to the European table. Loyalists mightn't thank them for it, but I think they will see that as part of their duty. And obviously the UK will still have a presence in Brussels in terms of lobbying, but I suspect Northern Ireland would not be high on the list of things that they would be lobbying the Commission and institutions about. So I think Northern Ireland will to some extent be voiceless, or become something that is represented through the lens of the Irish government, which, you know, doesn't give them that sort of self-ownership of that voice in any strong way. So that would be my sense.
Okay. Vernon, you have your hand up, Vernon.
Thank you. Can I first thank the Brexit Institute and organisers of the conference for allowing someone from this side of the Irish Sea to participate. I'm very grateful. I'm not quite sure if Professor Cox is right that there weren't warnings about Northern Ireland. If I remember rightly, John Major and Tony Blair, of course very much involved in the peace process, didn't speak in Northern Ireland warning people of what might happen, because that was in fact one of the reasons why I voted Remain. And as people have said, the Brexit process emphasises the question of identity, which the Good Friday Agreement tried to submerge. It brings back again the question of either or, where the Good Friday Agreement is in terms of and. But I think the problem that Unionists face in Northern Ireland is that after the grace period ends, customs declarations are required from goods going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. And that is fairly unprecedented. It's almost in effect a partition of the United Kingdom. And obviously people in Ireland will feel very sensitive about this because they were very unhappy about the partition of the island of Ireland, even though in 4 of the counties at least there were Unionist majorities, and also overall in the 6 counties. Now this is a partition which is not sought by the majority at the moment in Northern Ireland, who seem to have lost their right of self-determination. And they also fear, I suppose, that they'll be regulated by the EU without representation, that their interests will be represented probably by Ireland, which again is something Unionists object to. And the other point I'd like to make is this, and perhaps Mr. Ahern would be able to answer it. I mean, to a superficial reader like myself reading the Good Friday Agreement, there is no mention of a hard or soft border, because the presumption then was that Britain would remain in the EU. I don't think people at that time thought Britain might possibly leave. There's a lot about cooperation between Britain and Ireland and Northern Ireland and Ireland, but of course you can have cooperation between sovereign states. And the Good Friday Agreement did recognise that both states were sovereign. There's no element of joint sovereignty or joint authority in that agreement. So I'd like to ask Mr. Ahern whether it is in fact the case that the Good Friday Agreement dictates a soft border in Ireland. I'm agnostic and I have no view, but on a superficial reading, it seems to me to say nothing on that particular point. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yes, Eileen, would you like to speak to that?
Not if Bertie Ahern wants to speak first, as he was addressed.
Mr. Ahern, are you there? Okay.
Bertie, I saw you were trying to, I think I wrongly muted you. I'm going to ask you to speak now. If you have to click to activate. There you are.
Okay. Thanks, Eileen, for letting me in. No, in answer to that question, at no stage during the discussions on the Good Friday Agreement, or in the implementation of it all the way up to 2007, when the Democratic Unionist Party came on side, was there ever a consideration to the EU breaking with the UK? It was an issue that never ever came up. But the understanding all of the time was that Northern Ireland, and this was what the British government, the Irish government were very happy to do, the Americans, George Mitchell, who were supporting us, the EU, that if there was ever an issue, that the principle of consent would override everything. And that principle of consent is written into the protocol, into the withdrawal agreement. So I think the answer to the question is no, there was never a consideration, but unfortunately now the interpretation of the Unionist parties, all of them, and the combined loyalist groups, is that they totally understand the argument of nationalists and the Irish government to removing the border from north and south, but they feel putting it down the Irish Sea is the parallel breach, and that's the difficulty. And it's a real, as has been said correctly, this is a deep-seated issue. What we've managed to do since the 1st of January is move from an issue about the movement of horticultural goods and some foodstuffs and some veterinary products to now into a constitutional issue. And my fear is that whether we like it or not, the constitutional issue in the minds of unionists, I don't agree with them, but in the minds of unionists, this is now a constitutional issue. And I think that is where a real dilemma is for us in the island of Ireland, apart from the problems the EU have with the UK.
Thank you, Bertie. Eileen, you wanted to say something there?
I hate to be meek and mild, but I think Mick Fox was also ahead of me. So
don't worry, Eileen. No, I agree entirely with Bertie. How could I not? Because he was there on the historic day. I always took it as given that the Good Friday Agreement, one of its preconditions and assumptions was that Ireland and the UK were members of the European Union. It was a built-in assumption. You didn't even have to discuss it. You know, it just made that assumption because it detoxified borders, to use my own terminology. And of course, because of Brexit, we've retoxified borders. And indeed, as Bertie has just put, it's brought the constitutional question back where we didn't want it to be. In a very brief response quickly to Vernon, I don't want to go back over history, Vernon. My point was not exactly that nobody noticed this. In fact, I wrote about it quite a lot myself, having lived in the North for many years. But the people you mentioned who did warn about it were all Remainers. I mean, you know, Blair and John Major. I'm saying the Brexiteers didn't see this coming. I don't think they really saw this. It's another one of these appalling unintended consequences of taking decisions. Reasonable arguments. I can see that. I don't agree with it. And that's where we are today. So, you know, I take your point. I mean, there were people who weren't, but it wasn't the Brexiteers themselves. I remember having discussions at the time with a number of them. Oh, it's not an issue. It's not really an issue. That's my taking on it, Vernon, anyway.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Eileen, yeah.
Yeah, I'm agreeing, given we're all agreeing with Mick as well. I mean, John and I covered it in an earlier chapter we did with Federico, I think, that when Theresa May first started, you know, in-depth negotiations, Northern Ireland was, and the Good Friday Agreement, it just wasn't there. It just wasn't dealt with at all. And it was only towards the end that it was actually included. And also, to going back to a couple of Vernon's points, is I think it is a constitutional question now. I think the UK government, I'm not even sure they're capable of dealing with it in a way that won't exacerbate the situation. And I think, again, it's something John and I have written about. The question of sovereignty has actually been, over Northern Ireland, is being shifted by the Good Friday Agreement. The shift is subtle but definite. Before the Good Friday Agreement, the EU had nothing to say about, well, very, very, very little to say about Northern Ireland, because the UK was the sovereign state. It was an internal question for the UK. Since the Good Friday Agreement was in, which is an international treaty, UK sovereignty is modified and perceived to be modified, both internally within Ireland and externally by the EU and the US.
John, you wanted to say something briefly?
Yeah, I just, to your point, I mean, a piece of, I mean, Vernon's right, there was some people who raised, but we actually did a piece of work on media coverage on Britain. I mean, within Northern Ireland, the question of the border was literally every day. I mean, our first slide, the first poster, was actually from 2016, one of those big roadside posters. Mike Nesbitt actually raised the issue of ports explicitly in the 2016 referendum. But there was only one BBC discussion that had any substance on Ireland in the entire length of the referendum campaign. So if you were a neutral sitting there wondering which way you were going to vote, you'll be perfectly excused for never having considered Ireland from one end of your thinking to the day within the vote, if you're relying on the London-based media to inform you of the issues you need to take into account. And the final thing, and this is where I think unions have the real issue, is the principle of consent is very clearly mean, it's consensus politics in terms of domestic arrangements in Northern Ireland, double majority and that sort of thing. But it's very explicit that the constitutional question is 50% plus one, in terms of the ultimate decision about a referendum, but also by implication there's other ones. And the problem for Unionists today is they don't have 50% plus one who oppose the Northern Ireland Protocol. So on that broad constitutional question, they're seeking to bring it back to effectively that a majority of Unionists must agree to constitutional change. And that's just a numerical, non-runner, because there's only 3 Unionists left in Northern Ireland and 2 of them are against. Under the most ludicrous circumstances, you couldn't ever move forward. So I think the difficulty with the constitutional issue is the only way to resolve it is on a 50% plus one. And the protocol at the moment has that level of support and more.
All right, thank you, John. I have one question here from Ian Cooper to Dagmar. What are the prospects for the negotiation of a new UK-EU agreement that would supersede the most contentious aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol?
Oh, well, this is a political question. After yesterday, I'm very pessimistic. But I think we need to move forward in small steps, and to answer also the question on Northern Ireland representation. I think there are small steps which can be done. For example, Ireland could allow Northern Irish MEPs to be reinstated, and that would ensure not only nationalist but also unionist voices in Brussels, in the European Parliament. Going forward, the ignorance of Northern Irish issues would then be less, and like that. So for a new agreement, I think what the good thing about the protocol is that it does have in Article 12, it says the joint committee guided by the specialist joint committee on the protocol should going forward keep all the issues under review which are relevant for the all-Ireland cooperation, and it goes far beyond free movement of goods, and that gives the joint committee a say or a task to propose such changes of the protocol which are necessary. And so that's a institutional hook to hang your hat for changes on. At the moment, I wouldn't think it is very positive. At the moment, I would say what would be necessary, I think David Finnemore, who's also in the audience, has written on this, is a joint consultative working group should really be working, because a joint consultative working group is supposed to meet every month to prepare those discussions, what needs changing in the protocol. And if that meeting takes place every month, if Northern Irish politicians are included, not just London politicians, then perhaps you can get a discourse which with time leads to a condition where we can say the protocol can be changed with consensus. So that's what I have to say there at the moment. The legal position, the legal opportunity is there, but political, it's going to be difficult.
Thank you, Dagmar. I have one question here from Hugh Logue, who was Special Advisor to Seamus Mallon. For Michael, it says, given that there will be no Labour Party pressure for a Scottish referendum on the Tory government, what will force their hand, given that it is able by and large to ignore the support for SNP?
Is that one for me? Did you say?
Yes, that's for you, Michael.
God, I'm now an expert on Scotland. Well, I did live in Scotland for 5 years, as well as Ireland for 22, and Wales for 7. I've done all 4. Anyway. The pressure is going to come, frankly, from within Scotland itself. I mean, the point is, ignoring all the stuff that is going on at the moment between the two people, which I think is very sad, to be perfectly honest, because it takes away from the main fundamental question. But this really doesn't come on the British government. It really comes on what's going on in Scotland. The Labour Party has, in effect, to all intents and purposes, literally been wiped out in Scotland. And that's why I said earlier on why I think that it's going to be very difficult to ever see a Labour government again inside the UK, because it depended a very great deal on that huge Labour vote within the west of Scotland and the industrial parts of West Scotland. And that is gone. And that means, therefore, the SNP has an extraordinary hegemonic position within Scotland. And as John said earlier on, in terms of the various polls we are seeing on Scottish independence, it has shifted. Yesterday, I was listening to some stuff, John, as well, and somebody saying they only have 50% in favour of independence. I thought, only 50%? Give me a break. In the world I live in, and You know, 50% looks like you've got 5% more than the previous referendum, and that could be built up. So I think there's almost an irresistible pressure. There's going to be an irresistible pressure coming from within Scotland to move towards finally a referendum at some stage. I don't see how that can be resisted. It may not come now. From the SNP's point of view, it may not be a very good time for it to happen now. It's something you may want to defer for a month or maybe a whole year once we get through this current political crisis which is unfolded. But it will come. I just don't see how you can resist. This is not just a minority party, it's now the massive hegemonic bloc within Scotland, with Labour Party with a small voice, the Conservatives with a very small voice, and the Liberals with an even smaller voice. And given its dominance within the Scottish Parliament, that seems to me almost irresistible. I mean, how is Johnson in the end, or how's the Prime Minister, whoever it's going to be, and I assume it's going to be Johnson, how he's going to resist that kind of pressure? So that comes from within Scotland. And if Johnson were to resist that, you know, forever and ever and ever, and say, you're not going to have it, you're not going to have it, you're not going to have it, that again, it seems to me, would set up a new dynamic, which would actually accelerate the argument for independence. And let me just also add another point, which I hope is not being personal or political. Johnson is toxic in Scotland. He's absolutely toxic in Scotland. I was back in Glasgow, well, before the lockdown, going around talking to a lot of my Scottish friends. You know, he looks like the archetypal upper class, tough, Etonian Tory. And that does not go down terribly well in Scotland, as you well know. And if Johnson, with his persona and his politics and his background, you know, stands firm against this, I think that's only going to accelerate the constitutional crisis. And in the end, will actually increase the support for vote for independence for Scotland. I don't think we're going to get away from that one ever.
Okay, thank you for that, Michael. I don't know if he looks like those things. Perhaps he is the quintessential Etonian Tory.
I'm only quoting what my Scottish friends say. Yeah, of course, I couldn't possibly agree with that kind of assessment.
No, of course you couldn't. Too diplomatic, Michael.
Too diplomatic by far.
Yes. So listen, folks, this session has been hugely informative and a great way to start this gathering. Like everything, and this we know in Ireland a lot, that every ending is only a beginning. And to me, that Brexit didn't get things done. It only began the discussion, and it's going to go on a long time because, as I've said before, everything is connected to everything else. You can't talk about trade without talking about identity, without talking about the Constitution and so on. So I think the beginning of the discussion is good, and this was a great way to start this conference. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for their papers and to thank those for attending and for their questions. And I think Federico has a few final words to say.
Thank you, Derek.